All right, I'm excited. All right, we're excited to be recording today here in Laie, Hawaii. Today on the show we have Gale L. Pooley, PhD. He's an associate professor of business management at Brigham Young University, Hawaii. Dr. Pooley is taught at Al Faisal University in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Brigham Young University, Idaho, Boise State University, Idaho, and the College of Idaho. Dr. Pooley earned his BBA in economics at Boise State University. He did graduate work at Montana State University and completed his PhD at University of Idaho. He currently serves on the board for humanprogress.org. Thanks for coming. Welcome, Dr. Pooley.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, so today we want to kind of bring up a proposed bill that is going to be voted on at the Senate floor in Hawaii. It's Bill 789, and the bill proposes to raise the minimum wage in Hawaii to $15 an hour by 2023. So as an economics professor, we want to kind of ask you, what kind of ramifications would that have? Is this a good idea? Is this not? What's going to happen if this passes?
Well, like most legislation, it's going to be a good idea for some people and a not so good idea for other people. So being able to separate who's going to benefit from this policy and who's going to be harmed by it is what we try to do in economics, to identify all of the winners and all of the parties that are going to lose from this legislation. So we can talk about the winners and the losers. It's a good idea if you're going to be a winner, and it's a not so good idea if you're going to be a loser with that legislation. So with minimum wage, it's been a issue that economists have dealt with for a number of decades. What's the implication? Initially, we think about a labor market as like most markets, where people are free to enter that market, can leave that market, that the price in that market can move up and down. The labor market in general is not a free market in that sense. There are regulations about how long you can work, what conditions you can work under, and with this legislation, what kind of prices you can pay and earn. So lots of things going on that affect how that market operates. We tend to believe as economists that if you allow people to freely enter a market and you let price move up and down, that you create the maximum amount of value. So when you interfere in that market in some way with legislation, rules, and so forth, you tend to reduce the value creation ability of that market. So that's what I would say initially.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting because if you open any economics textbook, and it's pretty clear the science behind it, if you put a price ceiling or a price floor, you're going to mess with the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And that's exactly what a minimum wage law is, but you'll never hear it described as it'd be a price floor, yeah.
Right, floors are above us.
Yeah, because we're upside down.
And ceilings are below us, yeah.
So I just think it's interesting. Are we being misled? Is it misdirection? I mean, why is this promoted as an idea to help people?
Well, clearly there are going to be people that will benefit from that minimum wage law. And those beneficiaries are the first to be able to stand up and say, I'm going to enjoy this new minimum wage. I think the issue that you have with politics and economics, Thomas Sowell, one of my favorite economists, said something to the effect that the first law of economics is that we live in a world of scarcity. In other words, we have to make choices between things. And the first law of politics is ignore the first law of economics. In other words, can we pass legislation here that ignores the reality of a world of scarcity? And minimum wage laws kind of illustrate that once again. Can the government step into a market and impose a minimum price that is different than the current market price and expect everything else to remain the same? And we know that the laws of economics actually, like the laws of physics, you may challenge those, but you can't break those. The law of gravity dictates that something that falls from a certain distance is going to have this consequence. And we tend to believe in economics you have the same laws that apply in markets. Demand is downward sloping. In other words, the relationship between price and quantity is downward sloping. When you raise the price of something, the quantity demanded of that thing is going to be less. And if the demand curve was perfectly what we call inelastic, straight up and down, if you raise the price, quantity is not going to change. But labor, like most other things, that curve is not straight up and down. It's not perfectly inelastic, it's elastic. So as you begin to raise the price, you'll note that the quantity demanded is going to fall as well. So being able to step into a market with this intent of being able to help people that may not have the wage that they would like to have or that you would like to have them have, being able to pass a law to do that on your first impression, that sounds like a great idea. Like lots of legislation, it sounds like a good idea until you think about it. And the think about it is where we try to think about the consequence. A causes B. B also causes C. C could actually be worse than B. So you shouldn't do A to begin with. And we see that with minimum wage as well, where the intent is to try to help people that have incomes that are low. We look around and we see people that have low incomes. We'd like to be able to help them. Can the government step in and help those individuals by requiring that an employer pay them a higher wage? The issue is the employers also have agency or the freedom to make a choice. So when the government requires you to when the government requires you to pay a higher wage, the choice before you is, yes, if I'm an employer, I do have to pay a higher wage, but my other alternative is to not employ at all or to look for a substitute. And there's substitutes for human labor. And if you continue to raise the price higher and higher for labor, you're going to incentivize more and more development of substitutes for labor. I know when we go into McDonald's here in our little community that there are kiosks now that you can make orders. You have apps that do a lot of things that historically were done by humans. And that's all being replaced by apps and kiosks and technology.
Automation. Because
the price of labor has gotten really, really expensive.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, it's perfectly logical as a business owner. If you could have a machine do something for the same price as a human, a machine doesn't complain, a machine doesn't ask for a raise, a machine doesn't call in sick. So it seems pretty counterintuitive if you're going to try and help people to make decisions that lead to higher automation.
Yeah.
But if you were to pinpoint a demographic that would be harmed the most, or a couple, by raising the minimum wage, who would you identify as like the most in danger?
The first category are young people, because first job people. Where do they start their first job? My son, he gets his first job at Kentucky Fried Chicken, and boy, I go in there and watch him, and I think, you're going to get fired because you don't know anything. And I thought for sure he was going to get fired, and he comes home and do you still have a job? And yeah, I do. I said, well, that's amazing. You still have a job. And he goes to work the next day and comes home and he still has a job. And finally I go back in there after a month, and he's like got his headset on and he's taking orders and doing the things with the chicken and, telling other people how to do things. And his productivity went from here up to here. Well, the issue is if that firm cannot afford to hire him at this level where his productivity was zero and invest in him over this period of time to raise his productivity, if you set their requirements so high that they can never really make that investment to help that individual become productive, then you've locked them out of the market. They're never able to get into the market. So when you raise the minimum wage, what you will also note is you will also increase the unemployment rate for that category of individuals. You look at people that are, between 15 and 25, and their unemployment rate is significantly higher than the rest of the population. One, they don't have the productive skills yet. So that's the first kind of harm that you see, is these workers that don't have skills. The reason that they're earning what they're earning today is they don't have the skills to make them valuable at a higher wage rate. And how do people become valuable at a higher wage rate? Experience. So you prevent them from beginning this experience process where they can start becoming more and more productive. You know, a lot of economists talk about a ladder. You get on the ladder and you can climb this ladder. Well, what the minimum wage is it's lifted this ladder up so individuals can never reach the first rung of the ladder. So they're never able to start their first job. So that's kind of the first victim. The second victim are, they tend to be minorities. And the reason that that's the case is if you require someone's paying $10 an hour, now you require them to pay $15 an hour. You have more people that show up for that job, for example. You have more to choose from. Well, who do you tend to choose? Well, you might choose people that are more productive. You might choose people that you're more sympathetic with. So it allows you to discriminate against people based on some other factor other than their productivity. So minorities tend to also suffer when you raise the minimum wage. And you see that historically where certain markets, that was the method by which they were able to prevent certain minorities from participating in the labor market, was raising the minimum wage. So that would be the second group. It really comes back to people that are young, people that don't have the skills, and minorities that could be subject to discrimination because of these requirements. So those are the people that really suffer, and those are the people that really need the help, right? So we talk a lot about this idea of unintended consequences, the intentions versus the results. And we try to say, look, the result is what you need to think about, the consequence, not the intention. Now, I may have this intention of trying to help somebody, but the consequence could actually be very harmful to them because I don't maybe understand deep enough what that consequence entails. Medicine, we've had example after example in medicine where we thought that this was the way to solve a problem. You're sick, maybe the way to solve the problem is you have bad blood. So let's drain some of your blood out. The theory sounds great. The reality is that wasn't the way people got, and some people, when we did that, they would regain their health. And so it looked like the empirical evidence was supporting the theory. Yet we still had people that would die as a consequence of that. So we're trying to learn what the real connection and relationship is between things. And in economics, we deal with that every day. What is the real consequence here of that policy? And it's very easy if you're in politics to advocate a policy with this intention to try to help somebody. And the reality is that policy could end up being very harmful to them.
It's really interesting you bring up that point because every ad I've seen for Bill 789 and other bills like it and other protests and news coverage of all this kind of movement to raise the minimum wage wherever in the world or in the country, it always comes back to kind of the same argument. They have single mothers who share their story about not being able to provide for their family. You have minorities getting on the screen talking about how they came to this country and can't afford to stay here and their dreams are being taken away from them. They have these really compelling emotional stories. But then as we've talked and kind of thought it over, it seems like they're the ones that get harmed first, are the ones that are already disadvantaged. Right. So I kind of look at it as, I call it buffet politics, and it's kind of a phenomenon that happens specifically on the far progressive left. These ideas that sound good and you pick and choose out of this big buffet, but they're connected to each other. They're connected to things that are opposed to the platform. And so you have this idea of helping these people, and you have this idea that sounds good, but then it turns out harming them. I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. Is it that they don't know? Is it that they don't care? Have we given so much power to politicians to just offer us money that that they just take advantage of that as a political game, or what do you think's happening in the political world? It seems crazy.
Yeah, there's, I mean, a couple of things going on. I think I'd step back just a moment and talk about this idea that human beings, do they possess this fundamental dignity that they should be treated with the ability to enter into a transaction with another person? Can you and I come up with an agreement that both of us would be happy with? Economists, we tend to say, let people develop these agreements and arrangements with each other because that's a value creating process. Now, when a third party steps in between those two and says, no, you can't do that, you've deprived both of them of this fundamental human dignity to determine what they believe to be in their own best interest. You and I have an agreement. I would love to work for you for $10 an hour. You want to pay me $10 an hour. We're both happy about that. And then we have a third party that steps in and says, no, we're not going to let you do that anymore. You've got to pay $15 an hour. So what you've done is you've destroyed that value creation process between those two individuals. You've also created an incentive for them to do to do something illegal or unlawful. Yesterday it was legal to pay $10 an hour. We're happy. Today it's unlawful to pay $10 an hour. I've got to pay $15. So now you and I, if we want to continue to have that value creation relationship, we have to do it outside the law. And that's also very offensive to this idea that human beings have this dignity and this right to be able to seek relationships with other people that allow them to create value. Mm-hmm. So that would be another aspect of this that's troubling, is you're depriving people of the right to have these associations to create value for one another.
Yeah, the dignity of the individual and mutual. Yeah, that's very important. I totally agree with that. I also think it's really interesting as we look at it. People like to take economic issues and try and divide across party lines, right and left. And I don't think it needs to be that way at all. It doesn't need to be, the right champions economics and the left champions equality or freedom or whatever word you want to use. Because if we look at examples outside of the U.S., we would do well to learn from countries outside the U.S. We get so self-absorbed in our own craziness. But Denmark's a wonderful example of a progressive country that has, very high progressive taxation, a lot of socialist ideas and programs that is doing well economically. And if you really study them, they've changed a lot of things. They actually got privatized Social Security. They don't have any government form of retirement plans anymore. And they also got rid of their minimum wage laws. They allow the market to decide. So they've kept bits and pieces. I'm not saying that I agree so much with all of their policies, but that it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be right or left politics. It doesn't have to be total free market capitalism or total socialism. That there is middle ground and there is things we can learn from each other. And instead of getting so tied up in our identity politics and maybe reaching outside of ourselves, we could learn a lot.
Yeah, I think back to this, who benefits from an increase in minimum wage? What you're really doing is more productive workers are competing against less productive workers. And the idea there is if you raise the minimum wage, you're basically removing all of that competition from the market. You're removing those individuals from the market that would compete for you as a more productive worker. If I have to hire somebody at 15 an hour versus 10 an hour, I'm going to try to find somebody more productive. If you're a more productive person, you're worth 15 an hour, now you're eligible. That's who that employer is going to seek out. If the wage is lower than that, you're going to also consider these lower productive workers because you can pay them less. So it really represents a competition between more productive workers and less productive workers. It's not a competition between employers and employees. It's a competition between two different categories of employees. And you tend to notice that unions, for example, support minimum wage. And why would that be? Well, they tend to be more productive workers. And if we could increase the minimum wage, suddenly the demand for their skills, their
Increases.
workers is going to increase because you've eliminated their lower price competition.
I think that leads into one other kind of moral question I think we should discuss before we wrap up is, you hear it a lot, living wage. Let's raise the minimum wage to a living wage. No one should work and not be able to live off of what they earn. But is that necessarily true? Does every worker deserve a living wage? I mean, is there room for dependents to be working? Is there room for people to pool together? I mean, what kind of society are we trying to create? What's the answer to that question?
Well, living wage is a highly subjective and emotional. It's not a quantifiable value, yet it's very emotional.
Who decides?
Yeah, who's against a living wage? The issue is who decides what a living wage is for you and for me. Now, if someone is living on subsistence and they don't have sufficient for their food, medicine, does it make sense to go out and try to impose the cost on employers to be able to support that individual, or does it make more sense that all of us in the community contribute to help that individual? The issue with the minimum wage laws, when you're trying to help someone to have a living wage, is you are targeting those individual employers to deal with a social problem, not the community in general. The other issue with a living wage is where is that number? I mean, if you're in Guatemala, if you're in Texas, you're in Korea, you're in Philippines, where is that number? The other issue that you deal with is when you're comparing that, what are you comparing it to? We always think about you've got to compare your current situation against realistic alternatives that are really probable versus utopia. When we compare ourselves to utopia, we always lose.
We always fall short.
Yeah, we always fall short. So do we want people to have more income versus less? Yes. Well, how do we achieve that? Well, we've really got to look at how is wealth created? How do people create wealth that we then have to be able to sustain ourselves? Wealth primarily is this function of productivity, innovation, and these other things. And you look at different societies over time, and there have been societies that have clearly escaped poverty.
China.
Yeah, China, for example, is our most recent example. And how did they do it? Did they raise minimum wage to do that, or did they help people have the freedom to become more productive and innovative? So the policy really needs to be is how do we take these individual human beings and give them the conditions where they can really use their gifts and talents to become much more productive. And that's really what you've got to deal with. Back to the minimum wage, if you can really, if government can really go in and move a wage from 10 to 15 an hour without any other consequence, why don't they move it to 50 an hour?
Yeah, or 100.
Yeah, why don't they just move it up? If you can just move it up,
Magic.
and then suddenly everybody has this additional wealth, why stop at 15? So, once again, the initial sound of things, it sounds like my intent is to try to help someone that's dealing with low income. Can I, as a politician, pass a law that requires somebody else to deal with that problem? It's like that seems to me also to violate this kind of moral sense where now I'm requiring someone else to deal with this problem versus me personally.
Yeah, I agree. I've never really thought of it in terms of kind of a crime against individual sovereignty, but it is in a way.
Right. When we step in and we prevent people from creating value with one another, we really are violating their dignity. And in this case, you're preventing them from having this value creation activity, but you're also preventing them from discovering ways that they can become even more valuable. I mean, you learn when you go to work, you learn about what it takes to become more productive. And in many cases, that's the only way you learn about it. You can't go to school and learn about it. You've got to experience that. Get people on the learning curve. and let them begin to learn how to become more productive. School and education can help, but it really is that direct experience that seems to be really, really important.
Hopping on the ladder.
Yeah, get on the ladder and then not prevent them from climbing that ladder. The mobility of being able to move up and seek other opportunities. We're really kind of discriminating against these low productive workers. You know, we had laws in this country where you could legally discriminate against someone because of their race or their gender or their religion. And we've removed all of those laws. We've realized, you know, that's
wrong.
Yeah, that's wrong. That it doesn't recognize people's ability and their individual worth to be able to go out and have associations with other people to try to support themselves and their families, because you're discriminating based on this arbitrary thing. Minimum wages really do the same thing, but they're discriminating against people that don't have this experience or this ability to be productive.
Does the market have the capacity to adjust? So if I'm worth $10 an hour right now and you're worth 100 and we move it up to 15, is it possible for me to still, for the same labor, it adjust, like just inflation increase? So you get paid more, I get paid more.
Yeah, but then we get into this
inflation.
Yeah, and then
back to square one. So it doesn't help anything.
Right.
But those people that lost jobs could potentially re-enter, but just be back where they started.
They're going to be back where they started. The problem the problem is productivity. That's the problem. The reason that you're earning this is because of your productivity level. Look, if you start at $7 or $8 an hour and you become more experienced, you're going to become more and more valuable to that company. But you're also going to become more and more valuable to other companies. I always joke about, where does Burger King go to find their employees?
McDonald's.
They go to McDonald's, right? Because they can identify who's become productive there. Now, if I'm working at McDonald's and I start at 10 an hour and I get more and more productive and I'm really worth 15 an hour, what happens to me generally? Someone observes that and someone will make me an offer. The competition will actually elevate my income so it's proportionate to my productivity. So Burger King guys got to come to me and say, look, here's my card. You look like you're really productive here. You should give me a call. I don't know what they're paying you here, but maybe I could pay you more. Now, as an employee, what do you do with that card? It's like, maybe you go back to your manager and say, look, I think...
Make me an offer.
I think I'm more productive, right? I mean, the ability for individuals to be able to negotiate higher incomes really has to come back to their ability to make this contribution to this value creation process. If you can enlarge the pie and create more value for your company, then you can make the argument that you should have some kind of a larger share of that pie. Now, the beauty of competition is that if they choose not to do that, you now have other choices. And if you put somebody on this productivity curve, you're not only giving them more ability to become more productive, but you're giving them more opportunities for other association opportunities with other firms.
Very true. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Bill 789 would be counterproductive. That raising the minimum wage isn't really going to help who they've identified would benefit.
The response to this market not working like they would like it to work is even more intervention. So you end up with this market that gets
Vicious cycle.
Lots and lots of additional intervention in it, where you're really, once again, distorting what really should be occurring there, and you're destroying the wealth value creation process as part of that. Let's move the minimum wage. Well, people can't afford to, we have an unemployment problem. Well, now we have to worry about our unemployment problem. How do you service unemployed people? You raise taxes. And who's going to pay taxes? You've got to be earning money to be able to pay the taxes, so the taxes have to increase to be able to compensate for this problem. So you're trying to deal with an issue where you actually create a problem, and that problem creates two more problems.
And if my taxes go up, I want my wage to go up.
Yeah, so you create this, a vicious kind of a cycle of this intervention, which give people the freedom and the opportunity to cooperate with each other, and you remove lots and lots of this kind of value that's either being destroyed or it never has the opportunity to be created.
So would you say market freedom equates to an increase of wealth, generally speaking?
Yeah, well, how else is wealth created? How is wealth created? It's created when individuals figure out a way that they can serve one another. You can do this, I can do that. Let's trade with each other. If we can trade with one another, then both of us are going to come out of that trade better off. Both of us win. So you want to create an environment where people have this opportunity to trade, because once we start trading with each other, we can trust each other where we can trade, then we specialize. So look, you work on this, I'll work on that. I do this all day, you do that all day. We're both going to get better at doing those things. So being able to trade and then being able to specialize helps our productivity.
And our incentive for peace.
Yeah, our incentive to be able to have a relationship with each other that's now a cooperative relationship, but because both of us are benefiting from that. The other thing that it does is when we're able to create this wealth, it gives us the opportunity to think about innovation. I get to start having the resources and the time and the ability to think about doing things in a new way. And that ability to do things in a new way, to innovate, is really what we're interested in, because that's what lets us go from $2 a day to $30 or $40 a day. And that's what the planet's done, is we discovered this ability to innovate. But it requires that people have this freedom to do that. The freedom, and then the property rights and a legal system and all these things that go with it, that are really about how do we maximize people's freedom to create something of value. And policies that do that, countries that do that, become wealthy.
The evidence is clear.
Yeah, the countries that don't have those kinds of values in place or policies in place tend to just struggle. I mean, they really, really struggle. You fly over the Korean Peninsula at night, and what do you see? I mean, you see a stark contrast between two different economic systems. One system allows people the freedom. The other system, people don't have that freedom to create value. And you see it at night. No light, no value there being created.
Thank you. Just some final thoughts. I thought it was really interesting. I really enjoyed when you invited your friend, Mr. Ifosa, to come speak. And he shared an experience in his home country of Nigeria, wanting to give back and do some humanitarian work. So he went and built a well. And he talked about how the value that was added to that community was a lot in the short run. But then the well broke, and he couldn't afford to fix it eventually. After he fixed it a couple times, it kept breaking. And then he compared that story, which long run didn't have the greatest impact on the country, to those two brothers that started an instant noodle company in Nigeria, and it grew and it grew and it grew and really took off and ended up employing thousands and thousands of workers and adding $5 billion to the economy, raising people out of poverty. And I think we go about it such a wrong way. Capitalism gets such a bad rap, especially with my generation and modern thought. But really, if you look at world history, free market capitalism has done more to lift people out of poverty and increase peace than any other idea that I've come across or know of. And would you agree with that, or thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really, when we talk about free market capitalism, those are words that we're really fundamentally describing allowing people to have dignity. Mm-hmm. It's really human dignity. When people begin to treat one another with respect and dignity, recognizing dignity, we trust one another, we have this flourishing of wealth that begins to happen. When people are treated in ways or they're not giving the freedom to be able to experiment, to learn, to invent, to take things to the market, to see if they've actually created something of value, all those things prevent this wealth from being created. And wealth creation, Bill Gates said, capitalism has done a pretty good job. If you don't think so, you can move to North Korea.
Yeah,
And that's pretty harsh, but
that's true.
capitalism really
Yeah,
is this way. And fundamentally, aren't we all capitalists?
of
Aren't we
course.
all trying to figure out how to use the things around us in a way that we can create something that's valuable? And that's what capitalism is to give people the freedom to use the resources around them under a system of pretty simple rules and a court system where they can go and expect justice, where they have private property rights that they can negotiate with one another, where their property is safe. You don't have regulation or taxes or a government that's a predatory government. People that have those kind of conditions tend to do really well. Ephos's example really kind of had to do with people have to have a sense of equity. They have to feel like they own something before they really want to take care of it. When someone comes from the outside and drops a benefit on you, it deprives you of the ability to be able to learn how to create that wealth. And it also creates this dependency going forward in your life where you have this expectation that something else is going to come in and solve your problem. And the giver thinks, oh, this is great. I feel good that I've been able to spend this money on this well. Well, what you've done is you've prevented those people in that situation from learning about how to deal with their problem. You look back at the United States, and we look like these places 150 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, how were we able to escape those conditions to what we enjoy today? Because there was none of this, none of these programs back then. We escaped that condition because we were able to, one, face the challenge. Two, we had the conditions where we could have property, and we had a court system that was fairly just, where we could expect some justice, and we had the ability to keep a portion of our labor. So you had the right conditions for incentives and a court system and the rule of law, but you also had a moral system that said we're going to let people experiment, let people try to figure things out. We don't know who's going to have these ideas that are going to change the world. We don't know who they are. So in order to find those people, you've got to let everybody try. Let everybody come and play the game. And if you do, people will lift one another out of poverty.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. Thank you so
All right.
much, Dr. Pooley.
Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right.